The flames licked at the edges of Samuel Ryder's barn like greedy tongues, consuming everything in their wake, including the life he had once known. He was only 24, but on that sweltering Montana night in 1878, he aged a decade as he desperately fought to save his parents trapped inside. The screams still haunted him 2 years later as he rode into the small settlement of Whispering Pines, his gloved hands gripping the reins of his chestnut mare, his eyes fixed forward, revealing nothing of the turmoil that churned within. The sun hung low in the western sky, casting long shadows across the dusty main street. Samuel's broad shoulders were set in a rigid line as he guided his horse toward the only saloon in town. 2 years of drifting from one cattle ranch to another had taught him to keep to himself, to work hard, and to never remove the gloves that hid his scarred hands, constant reminders of his failure. He dismounted with practiced ease, tying his horse to the hitching post outside the Broken Spur saloon. Inside, the air was thick with tobacco smoke and the scent of cheap whiskey. A piano player tapped out a melancholy tune in the corner, while several tables of card players focused intently on their games. Samuel made his way to the bar, keeping his head down. "What'll it be?" asked the bartender, a burly man with a thick mustache. "Whiskey," Samuel replied, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke more than necessary, finding comfort in silence. The bartender slid a glass across the counter. Samuel raised it with his gloved right hand, downing the amber liquid in one swift motion. The burn in his throat was familiar, almost welcome compared to the other pain he carried. "You looking for work?" the bartender asked, already reaching for the bottle to pour another shot. Samuel nodded once. Miller's Ranch, about 5 miles west of town, is hiring hands. Lost a few to that new silver strike up north. Samuel nodded again and placed a coin on the counter. Information was valuable in these parts, and he was grateful for the lead. As he turned to leave, the saloon doors swung open, and a slender woman with auburn hair entered. She wore a simple dress of blue calico, modest compared to the painted women who worked the saloon, and carried a leather satchel. The room quieted momentarily as several pairs of eyes turned to assess the newcomer. "Is there a doctor in town?" she asked, her voice clear and determined. The bartender shook his head. "Doc Simmons passed last winter. Nearest physician is in Clearwater, 2 days' ride." The woman's shoulders sagged slightly, but her chin remained high. "Then I suppose I've arrived just in time. I'm Charlotte Fairchild. I'm a doctor." A ripple of murmurs spread through the saloon. Samuel watched as disbelief crossed the faces of several patrons. A female doctor was uncommon enough in the East, but here in the Montana Territory, it was almost unheard of. "A woman doctor," someone scoffed. "I trained at the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania," she replied evenly. "I've come to establish a practice here." Samuel found himself staring at her. There was something about her steady gaze and the quiet confidence in her posture that struck him. While others might see only her gender, he recognized the determination in her eyes, the same kind that had driven him to pull his mother and father from the flames, even when it was too late. "Town council might have something to say about that," the bartender commented, though not unkindly. "I'm sure they will," Charlotte replied with a slight smile. "In the meantime, could someone direct me to a place where I might stay? Mrs. Peterson runs a boarding house at the end of the street," a silver-haired man at one of the tables offered. "Clean place, fair prices." "Thank you," Charlotte said. As she turned to leave, her eyes met Samuel's briefly. He looked away quickly, uncomfortable with the connection, however fleeting. Outside, Samuel untied his horse and swung into the saddle. He'd heard enough to know that Miller's Ranch was his best prospect, but as he guided his mount down the dusty street, he found himself riding past the boarding house Charlotte had been directed to. She stood on the porch, speaking with an older woman who must have been Mrs. Peterson. Samuel pulled the brim of his hat lower and continued on, unsure why the woman doctor had captured his attention so completely. Perhaps it was her courage in the face of certain opposition. Or perhaps it was simply that her arrival represented something new in a town where he hoped to finally stop running from his past. By the time Samuel reached Miller's ranch, the sun had set, leaving only a faint purple glow on the western horizon. Lanterns glowed in the bunkhouse windows, and the smell of cooking food drifted from the main house. He dismounted at the corral fence, where a weathered man with a silver-streaked beard was checking the legs of a nervous colt. "Mr. Miller," Samuel called, keeping his distance. The man straightened. "That's me. What can I do for you? Heard you might be looking for hands. I can ride, rope, and brand with the best of them." Miller studied him for a long moment. "Got experience with cattle?" "Yes, sir." "Worked 3 drives from Texas to Kansas. Spent a year on the Johnson spread in Wyoming, and most recently 6 months with the Bar X in Colorado." Miller nodded slowly. "What's your name, son?" "Samuel Ryder." "Well, Ryder, I could use another experienced hand. Pays fair 30 a month plus room and board. Season's just starting, so there's plenty of work ahead." Samuel nodded. "I appreciate it, Mr. Miller." "Bunkhouse is over there," Miller said, gesturing to a long, low building. "Find yourself a bunk. Cookie's probably got some supper left if you're hungry." "Thank you," Samuel said, leading his horse toward the barn. As he unsaddled his mare and settled her for the night, he was aware of eyes watching him from the bunkhouse door. New hands were always scrutinized, measured for their worth before being accepted. Samuel had grown accustomed to the process. He'd work hard, keep to himself, and eventually earn a place among them. That was all he needed: work to occupy his days and a roof over his head, nothing more. The bunkhouse was warm and filled with the scents of tobacco, coffee, and unwashed men. 6 cowboys looked up as Samuel entered, their conversations pausing momentarily. "You the new hand?" asked a lanky man with a shock of red hair. Samuel nodded. "I'm Ted," the redhead said. "That's Olson, Parker, Martinez, Doyle, and the old-timer there is Hank." Hank, a wizened cowboy with deep creases etched into his leathery face, spat tobacco juice into a can near his bunk. "Ain't that old," he grumbled. "There's an empty bunk in the corner," Ted continued, pointing. "Cookie saved you some stew if you're hungry." Samuel nodded his thanks and moved to claim the bunk. He placed his saddlebags beneath it and hung his hat on a peg. The room had returned to its previous conversations, allowing him to blend into the background. He preferred it that way. After a simple meal of beef stew and cornbread, Samuel settled onto his bunk. He removed his boots but kept his gloves on, as always. The other cowboys noticed but said nothing. In the West, a man's business was his own unless he chose to share it. Sleep came fitfully that night, as it often did. Images of flames and memories of screams invaded his dreams, waking him several times in a cold sweat. By dawn, he was already up and dressed, eager to begin work and push the memories aside. The first week passed in a blur of activity. Spring roundup was underway, with cattle scattered across Miller's vast range needing to be gathered, counted, and branded. Samuel worked from sunrise to sunset, grateful for the physical exhaustion that left him too tired to think when night came. He proved his worth quickly, showing skill with horses and cattle that earned nods of approval from even the most experienced hands. It was on a supply run to town that he encountered Charlotte Fairchild again. Samuel had volunteered for the task, knowing the solitary ride would give him time to clear his head. As he loaded supplies into the wagon outside the general store, he noticed a small building across the street with a freshly painted sign. Dr. C. Fairchild, physician. His curiosity got the better of him, and he found himself watching the building as he worked. The door opened, and an elderly woman emerged, followed by Charlotte. The older woman patted Charlotte's arm gratefully before making her way down the street. Charlotte stood on the small porch for a moment, her gaze traveling across the street until it landed on Samuel. Recognition flashed in her eyes, and to his dismay, she raised a hand in greeting and began walking toward him. Samuel considered mounting the wagon and leaving immediately, but something held him in place. "Good afternoon," Charlotte said as she approached. "I believe we were in the saloon at the same time last week. I'm Dr. Charlotte Fairchild." Samuel nodded, uncomfortable with the direct address. "Samuel Ryder," he replied, his voice low. "Are you working in the area, Mr. Ryder?" she asked, seemingly undeterred by his reticence. "Miller's Ranch," he said, gesturing vaguely toward the west. "I see. Well, should you or any of the other hands require medical attention, I've established my practice here." Her eyes drifted to his gloved hands, and for a moment Samuel felt exposed, as though she could see through the leather to the scars beneath. He flexed his fingers unconsciously, drawing her attention away. "I'll let them know," he said. Charlotte seemed about to say something else, but the sound of raised voices from down the street caught their attention. A group of men had gathered outside what appeared to be the town hall, their expressions ranging from concern to outright anger. "Excuse me," Charlotte said, already moving toward the commotion. "I believe that concerns me." Samuel watched as she approached the group with her head held high. From the snippets of conversation that carried to him, he gathered that the town council was divided on whether to allow her to practice medicine in Whispering Pines. Some argued that a woman had no place as a doctor, while others pointed out the desperate need for medical care in the remote community. He found himself admiring her composure as she faced the opposition directly, speaking clearly and respectfully, but without backing down. There was a quiet strength to her that reminded him of his mother, a woman who had run their farm with efficiency and grace while his father worked as a blacksmith. The comparison brought an unexpected pang of grief, and Samuel turned away, finishing his loading quickly. As he climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins, he glanced back once more. Charlotte stood surrounded by the group of men, a solitary figure in a blue dress, yet somehow she seemed to command the space around her. Samuel snapped the reins and headed back toward the ranch, pushing thoughts of the determined doctor from his mind. He had no place for such distractions. His life was simple now: work, eat, sleep. Anything else invited complications he couldn't afford. The following days brought a change to the routine at Miller's Ranch. A young cowhand named Jimmy took a fall while breaking a particularly stubborn horse, resulting in a badly broken arm. Miller immediately sent for the doctor from Whispering Pines. When Charlotte arrived, Samuel made himself scarce, volunteering for fence mending duty in the far pasture. He worked alone all day, returning only after sunset in hopes that she would be gone. But as he approached the bunkhouse, he saw her emerge from the main house where Jimmy had been taken. Miller walked beside her, nodding at something she was saying. Samuel considered diverting to the barn, but it was too late. Miller had spotted him and raised a hand in greeting. "Ryder, come meet our new doctor. She did a fine job setting Jimmy's arm." With no way to avoid the encounter, Samuel approached reluctantly, his hat pulled low over his eyes. "We've met briefly," Charlotte said with a smile that seemed to brighten the gathering dusk. "In town last week," Miller nodded. "Good, Dr. Fairchild will be checking on Jimmy every few days. She's also agreed to look at any other medical issues the hands might have." "Been too long since we had proper medical care in these parts," Samuel nodded, acutely aware of his gloved hands. "Jimmy doing all right?" he asked, directing the question to Miller. "He'll mend," Charlotte answered instead. "The break was clean and he's young. With proper care, he should regain full use of his arm." "That's good news," Samuel said, still not meeting her eyes directly. An awkward silence fell, broken when Miller announced, "Well, I should get the doctor back to town before it gets too dark. Ryder, would you mind saddling her horse?" Unable to refuse, Samuel nodded and turned toward the barn. He was aware of Charlotte following him, though she maintained a respectful distance. Inside the cool darkness of the barn, he moved to where her bay gelding was stabled. "You don't like doctors," Charlotte observed quietly as he worked. It wasn't a question. Samuel paused, then continued saddling the horse. "No reason to." Everyone has reasons for the things they do or don't do, she replied. After a moment, she added, those gloves, for instance, you never remove them. Samuel's hands stilled on the cinch he was tightening. My business, he said curtly. Of course, Charlotte agreed. I apologize for prying. He finished securing the saddle and turned to face her, finally meeting her eyes. They were a clear, intelligent hazel that seemed to see more than he was comfortable revealing. No need to apologize, he said, his voice softer than intended. Not much for conversation is all, she smiled slightly. I've noticed, though I suspect you have much more to say than you let on, Mr. Ryder. Before Samuel could respond, Miller appeared at the barn door. Ready to go, doctor. Charlotte nodded, then turned back to Samuel. Thank you for your help. She hesitated, then added, if you ever need anything medical or otherwise, my door is always open. Samuel watched as Miller helped her mount, a strange disquiet settling over him as they rode away. There was something unsettling about Charlotte Fairchild, not in an unpleasant way, but in how she seemed to see past the barriers he had so carefully constructed around himself. That night, as he lay in his bunk listening to the snores of the other men, Samuel stared at his gloved hands in the dim moonlight filtering through the window. He couldn't remember the last time someone had commented on them. Most people in the West minded their own business, accepting quirks and oddities without question. But Charlotte had noticed, and more than that, she had wondered. The next few weeks brought an unusual amount of rain to the region, turning the rangeland lush and green but making work miserable. The cowboys rode in sodden clothes, returning to the bunkhouse each evening to hang their gear near the stove in hopes it might dry by morning. During one particularly violent storm, lightning struck a tree near the western boundary of Miller's property, igniting a fire despite the rain. Samuel was among the hands who rode out to ensure it didn't spread to the grassland where the herd grazed. The sight of flames, even small ones being doused by rain, made his heart race. He worked frantically to help extinguish the burning tree, ignoring the warnings of the others to be careful. It was in this frenzy that disaster struck. A burning branch crashed down, catching Samuel's right arm. His thick coat protected him from serious injury, but in his panic to escape the flames, he slipped in the mud and fell hard, landing awkwardly on his hand. Pain shot through his wrist, and he knew immediately that something was wrong. Ted helped him back onto his horse once the fire was fully extinguished. You need to have that looked at, he said, eyeing the way Samuel cradled his right arm. Could be broken. It's fine, Samuel insisted through gritted teeth, though the throbbing pain suggested otherwise. Don't be stubborn, Ted replied. Miller won't take kindly to you working injured and making it worse. Doctors in town. The thought of Charlotte examining his hands sent a cold dread through Samuel. I've had worse, he muttered, but when they returned to the ranch and Miller saw Samuel's swollen wrist, he insisted. Ryder, take one of the spare horses and get to town. Have Dr. Fairchild look at that wrist. Can't afford to lose another hand to injury right now. Knowing he couldn't refuse a direct order from his employer, Samuel reluctantly set out for Whispering Pines. The rain had subsided to a gentle drizzle, and the evening light cast long shadows as he rode into town. Charlotte's small clinic was lit from within, a warm glow emanating from the windows. Samuel tied his horse at the hitching post and hesitated, considering whether he might simply wait until the swelling subsided on its own. But the pain had only intensified during the ride, and he knew that an untreated broken bone could heal improperly, potentially ending his career as a cowhand. With a deep breath, he knocked on the door. Charlotte opened it almost immediately, surprise registering on her face before concern took its place. Mr. Ryder, are you all right? He nodded stiffly. Took a fall. Miller thought you should look at my wrist. Of course, come in, she said, stepping aside to allow him entry. The clinic was small but meticulously organized. An examination table stood in the center, while shelves lined with medicines and supplies covered one wall. A small stove in the corner provided both heat and hot water. Sit down, Charlotte instructed, gesturing to the table. As Samuel perched awkwardly on the edge, she moved to wash her hands in a basin. What happened? Lightning struck a tree. We went to make sure the fire didn't spread. I fell. She approached him, drying her hands on a clean cloth. I'll need to examine your wrist, she said gently. You'll have to remove your glove. Samuel tensed. This was exactly what he had feared. Can't you check it with the glove on? Charlotte studied him for a moment, her expression softening with understanding. Whatever you're hiding, Mr. Ryder, I've seen worse in my medical training. Burns, amputations, battlefield injuries, nothing will shock me. Samuel looked away, his jaw clenched. The pain in his wrist pulsed with each heartbeat, leaving him little choice. With his left hand, he slowly began to peel the glove from his right. The leather stuck in places where blood had seeped through from fresh scrapes, and he winced as it pulled free. Charlotte's expression remained neutral. As his hand was revealed the skin a patchwork of shiny, mottled scars, evidence of severe burns long since healed. Some areas were pink and smooth, others puckered and ridged. His fingers, though functional, were stiff and slightly curled. May I? She asked quietly, her hands hovering near his. Samuel nodded once, unable to look at her. Her touch was gentle, clinical as she carefully manipulated his wrist, testing for breaks. I don't believe it's broken, she said after a thorough examination. A severe sprain, certainly. You've torn ligaments, which can sometimes be more painful and take longer to heal than a clean break. She moved to a shelf and selected bandages and a small brown bottle. I'm going to wrap it and give you something for the pain. As she worked, her fingers occasionally brushed against the scarred skin of his hand. Samuel expected revulsion, or at the very least, professional detachment. What he didn't expect was the gentle care with which she handled his damaged flesh, as though it were no different from any other injury she might treat. These burns are old, she observed as she applied a salve to the fresh scrapes before beginning to wrap his wrist. Samuel nodded, still not meeting her gaze. They've healed remarkably well, all things considered, she continued. You have good range of motion in your fingers. Someone knew what they were doing when they treated you initially. A woman in the next town, Samuel said, his voice low. Her husband was a doctor before he passed. She'd assisted him for years. Charlotte nodded as she continued her careful bandaging. She did good work. Many burn victims lose much more function. Not good enough, Samuel muttered before he could stop himself. Charlotte paused, her eyes finding his. The physical healing is only part of recovery, Mr. Ryder. Sometimes the wounds we can't see take the longest to mend. Something in her words, or perhaps the quiet understanding in her eyes, caused a crack in the wall Samuel had built around himself. I couldn't save them, he said, the words escaping like birds from an opened cage. My parents, the fire spread too fast. Charlotte resumed her bandaging, allowing him the dignity of continuing without her staring at him. I'm sorry, she said simply. 2 years ago, Samuel continued, uncertain why he was sharing this with her but unable to stop. Lightning struck our barn during a drought. Everything was so dry. My father went in to save the horses. My mother followed when he didn't come out. I tried to pull them both out, but... He flexed his scarred fingers involuntarily. Too late. Charlotte secured the bandage with a small metal clip, then finally looked up at him. That's not a failure on your part, Samuel. That's courage most men would never find. The use of his first name, spoken so gently, caught him off guard. No one had called him Samuel since his mother. He was always Ryder to the other hands, or just you when someone needed his attention. Doesn't feel like courage, he admitted. Feels like failure. Courage isn't about succeeding, Charlotte replied. It's about trying when success seems impossible. She stepped back slightly. Keep the bandage dry. Come back in a few days so I can check how it's healing, and try to use that hand as little as possible for the next week. Samuel nodded, reaching for his glove. He struggled to pull it over the bulky bandage, and after watching his efforts for a moment, Charlotte spoke again. I have something that might work better until your wrist heals, she said, moving to a cabinet. She returned with a pair of soft leather gloves larger than his own. These belonged to my father. He had large hands, they should fit over the bandage. Samuel hesitated, then accepted the offering. Thank you, he said, the words feeling inadequate for the kindness she had shown him. You're welcome, she replied with a small smile. That's what neighbors are for. As he rode back to the ranch in the gathering darkness, Samuel found himself pondering her words. Neighbors. It had been a long time since he had allowed himself to feel part of any community, perhaps too long. The next day, Miller assigned Samuel to lighter duties around the ranch while his wrist healed. It chafed to be given what he considered women's work, helping in the garden, mending tack, and assisting Cookie with meal preparations, but he understood the necessity. A cowhand with only one good arm was of limited use on the range. It was during this period of enforced inactivity that Samuel began to notice changes in the town of Whispering Pines. Each time he made a supply run, he observed Charlotte's growing integration into the community. Children waved to her on the street, women stopped to chat with her outside the general store, and even some of the men who had initially opposed her practice now tipped their hats in greeting. 4 days after his injury, Samuel returned to Charlotte's clinic as instructed. He found her tending to a young boy with a cut on his forehead. The child's mother hovered nearby, anxiety clear on her face. Just a few more stitches, Timothy, and we'll be done, Charlotte was saying as Samuel entered. You're being very brave. The boy, no more than 7, had tears streaming down his face but sat perfectly still as Charlotte worked. When she finished, she applied a small bandage and gave him a piece of hard candy from a jar on her desk. Perfect patient, she declared with a warm smile. After the mother and child left, Charlotte turned her attention to Samuel. Right on time, Mr. Ryder. How's the wrist feeling? Better, he admitted, extending his arm for her inspection. He had removed the borrowed glove before entering, a small but significant concession. Charlotte unwrapped the bandage carefully, her fingers cool against his skin as she examined the injury. The swelling has gone down considerably. You've been following my instructions. Didn't have much choice, Samuel replied. Miller's had me feeding chickens and shelling peas. A smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Not exactly the heroic duties of a cowboy. No, he agreed, surprised to find himself almost returning her smile. Can't say I'm fond of chickens. Nasty tempers, Charlotte laughed, the sound bright and unexpectedly pleasant. They do have rather disagreeable personalities, she agreed. My aunt raised them when I was a girl. I was terrified of the rooster. The image of a young Charlotte running from an angry rooster brought a genuine smile to Samuel's face, brief though it was. Charlotte noticed and seemed pleased by the reaction. I'll rewrap this, she said, reaching for fresh bandages. Another few days, and you should be able to return to light riding duties, though I'd avoid roping for at least 2 weeks. As she worked, Samuel found himself studying her face. Framed by auburn hair pulled back in a practical style, her features were delicate but strong high cheekbones, a straight nose, and expressive eyes that reflected intelligence and compassion in equal measure. How did you decide to become a doctor? He asked, surprising himself with the question. Charlotte glanced up briefly before returning her attention to the bandage. My younger brother fell ill when I was 16, she said. The local doctor couldn't determine what was wrong, and we lost him. I decided then that I wanted to understand the human body to help others avoid such losses if possible. I'm sorry about your brother, Samuel said quietly. Thank you, she replied. It was a long time ago, but it shaped the course of my life. She secured the bandage and stepped back. What about you? Were you always a cowhand? Samuel shook his head. My father was a blacksmith. I worked with him, learning the trade. He flexed his damaged fingers. After the fire, I couldn't manage the finer work anymore. Cattle don't mind if your grip isn't perfect. Charlotte nodded thoughtfully. Have you ever tried using tools modified for your hands? With the right adaptations, you might be able to return to blacksmithing. The suggestion caught Samuel off guard. he had never considered that his father's trade might still be accessible to him. "Never thought of that," he admitted. "Sometimes we need an outside perspective to see possibilities we've overlooked," Charlotte said with a gentle smile. "Think about it. Whispering Pines could use a blacksmith. The nearest one is in Clearwater." As Samuel left the clinic, his mind turned over her words. He had accepted his limitations without question after the fire, but perhaps there were other options. For the first time in 2 years, he allowed himself to consider a future beyond drifting from ranch to ranch. Spring gave way to early summer, and Samuel's wrist healed enough for him to return to regular duties. He continued to wear Charlotte's father's gloves, finding them more comfortable than his old pair. Each time he put them on, he was reminded of her kindness, a dangerous thought that he tried, with limited success, to push aside. Their paths crossed with increasing frequency as Charlotte made regular visits to the ranch to check on Jimmy and other minor injuries among the hands. Samuel no longer avoided her, though he maintained a certain reserve. Still, the other cowboys noticed the change in him, subtle smiles that occasionally broke through his serious demeanor, a willingness to join conversations when Charlotte was present. "Doc's got you figured out," Ted observed one evening as they sat on the bunkhouse porch, watching the sunset. "Never seen you talk so much as when she's around." Samuel shrugged, uncomfortable with the observation but unable to deny it. There was something about Charlotte that made him want to emerge from his self-imposed isolation, like a creature too long in darkness being drawn to light. It was late June, when a summer storm brought disaster to Whispering Pines. Lightning struck again, this time igniting a fire in the dry grass fields to the east of town. Strong winds pushed the flames toward the settlement with frightening speed. The call went out to all nearby ranches for men to help fight the fire before it reached the town. Samuel felt the familiar terror grip him as Miller gathered the hands. Fire, again. His nightmares come to life. For a moment he considered refusing to go, but the thought of others suffering as his parents had steeled his resolve. He would face his fear. The men rode hard for town, where chaos reigned. Sheriff Thompson was organizing the firefighting efforts, directing men to different sectors of the advancing fire line. Samuel was assigned to the eastern edge, closest to where the flames threatened several outlying homes. The heat was intense, the smoke choking as they worked to create fire breaks and beat back the flames with wet blankets. Samuel worked mechanically, forcing his mind to focus on the task rather than the memories that threatened to overwhelm him. Sweat soaked his shirt, and ash coated his face as he moved tirelessly alongside the other men. Hours into the battle, a shout went up from near one of the isolated homesteads. "There's someone still inside," a man called, pointing to a small cabin partially engulfed in flames. Without conscious thought, Samuel found himself running toward the burning structure. The heat intensified as he approached, the roaring of the fire drowning out the shouts behind him. He pulled his bandana over his nose and mouth and plunged through the door. Inside, smoke billowed in thick clouds, making it nearly impossible to see. Samuel dropped to his knees where the air was marginally clearer and began to crawl through the main room. "Anyone here?" he called, his voice raw from smoke and exertion. A faint cry answered him from what appeared to be a back bedroom. Samuel moved toward it, ignoring the cracking of timbers overhead and the encroaching flames. In the bedroom, he found an elderly man trapped beneath a fallen beam, conscious but unable to move. "Help me," the man gasped, his voice barely audible over the fire's roar. Samuel assessed the situation quickly. The beam was too heavy to lift alone, but he might be able to shift it enough for the man to crawl free. He positioned himself and pushed with all his strength, ignoring the searing pain as the hot wood made contact with his gloved hands. The beam moved just enough. "Can you move?" Samuel asked urgently. The old man nodded and began to drag himself clear. Once free, Samuel helped him to his feet, supporting most of his weight as they made their slow way toward the door. The roof was beginning to collapse, sending showers of sparks and burning debris around them. They were almost at the door when a flaming rafter crashed down directly in their path. Without hesitation, Samuel pushed the old man ahead of him, using his body as a shield. They stumbled through the doorway and out into the relative safety of the yard, where several men rushed forward to help the elderly man. Samuel barely registered their presence. His hands were on fire, the leather gloves doing little to protect him from the burning timber he had pushed aside. In a daze, he pulled them off, revealing angry red blisters forming over his already scarred skin. Someone was speaking to him, guiding him away from the burning cabin, but the words didn't register. The world had narrowed to the pulsing pain in his hands, and the haunting familiarity of it all, the heat, the smoke, the sense of desperate urgency. He became aware of his surroundings again, only when cool water washed over his burned hands. He was sitting on a bench outside the general store, which had been converted to a temporary medical station. And Charlotte was kneeling before him, gently treating his injuries. "You shouldn't have gone in there alone," she was saying, her voice tight with what might have been anger or fear. "That was reckless, Samuel." "Couldn't let him die," Samuel replied, his voice a harsh rasp. Charlotte looked up at him then, and he was startled to see tears in her eyes. "No, you couldn't, because that's who you are." She returned her attention to his hands, applying a soothing salve to the burns. "These aren't as severe as they could have been. The gloves provided some protection." Samuel watched her work, fascinated by the gentle competence of her movements. "Your father's gloves," he said suddenly. "I'm sorry." "Don't be ridiculous," Charlotte replied, though her voice had softened. "They served their purpose, saved your hands from worse damage." She began to carefully wrap bandages around his injuries. "Old Mr. Jenkins is alive because of you. His grandson says thank you." Samuel nodded, suddenly exhausted as the adrenaline drained from his system. The fire was mostly contained now, with men still working to extinguish the remaining hotspots, but the immediate danger had passed. "You need rest," Charlotte said, securing the last bandage. "And these burns need proper care. I want you to stay in town tonight where I can keep an eye on them." Too tired to argue, Samuel allowed himself to be led to the boarding house, where Mrs. Peterson quickly prepared a room. Charlotte helped him upstairs, supporting him when he swayed with fatigue. The room was small but clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand. "I'll check on you in the morning," Charlotte said as she helped him sit on the edge of the bed. "Try to keep your hands elevated if you can." Samuel nodded, his eyelids heavy. As Charlotte turned to leave, he reached out instinctively, catching the fabric of her skirt with his bandaged fingers. "Thank you," he said, the words carrying more weight than just gratitude for his medical care. Charlotte's expression softened. "Rest, Samuel," she said quietly. "Everything else can wait." He slept deeply that night, for the first time in years untroubled by nightmares of fire and loss. When he woke, sunlight was streaming through the window, and Charlotte was sitting in a chair beside the bed, reading a medical journal. "Good morning," she said, setting the book aside. "How do you feel?" "Like I've been kicked by a horse," Samuel admitted, sitting up carefully. The pain in his hands had settled to a dull throb more manageable than the night before. "Not surprising," Charlotte replied. "You inhaled quite a bit of smoke in addition to the burns." She stood and moved to the washstand, pouring water into a basin. "Let me check your hands." As she unwrapped the bandages, Samuel found himself studying her face, the small furrow of concentration between her brows, the loose strand of auburn hair that had escaped its pins, the faint smudge of ash still visible along her jawline from the previous day's chaos. "The blisters haven't broken," she observed with satisfaction. "That's good. It means the burns are healing cleanly." She reapplied salve and fresh bandages with the same gentle care she had shown the night before. "How's the town?" Samuel asked as she worked. "We were fortunate." The fire was contained before it reached the main street. 3 outlying structures were lost, including Mr. Jenkins' cabin, but no lives. She secured the last bandage and stepped back. It could have been much worse. Samuel flexed his fingers cautiously, testing the limits of movement within the bandages. How long before I can work? Charlotte shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. Always practical, Mr. Ryder. I'd recommend at least a week of light duty. Your hands need time to heal, especially given their previous injuries. Miller won't like that, Samuel muttered. Mr. Miller stopped by this morning, Charlotte informed him. He said to tell you that your job is secure and you're to follow doctor's orders. I believe his exact words were, "Tell that stubborn fool I won't have him maiming himself permanently for the sake of a few days' work." A reluctant smile tugged at Samuel's mouth. Sounds like him. He also mentioned that he's been considering hiring a ranch blacksmith, Charlotte added casually, though her eyes watched him closely for his reaction. Apparently, sending to Clearwater for every broken piece of equipment is becoming impractical as the ranch expands. Samuel's heart quickened at the implication. Did you suggest that to him? Charlotte's cheeks colored slightly. I may have mentioned that a talented blacksmith would be an asset to the ranch, and that I happen to know someone with experience in the trade. I told you, I can't do the fine work anymore, Samuel reminded her, though without the bitterness that would have colored such a statement only weeks before. I also mentioned that, Charlotte acknowledged, and suggested that with some adaptations to the tools and techniques, your experience would still be invaluable. She paused, then added more softly, the decision is yours, of course, but I thought you should know the opportunity exists. Samuel looked down at his bandaged hands, considering her words. The idea of returning to his father's trade, of creating rather than merely maintaining, stirred something he had thought long buried hope. I'll think about it, he said finally, raising his eyes to meet hers. Good, Charlotte replied with a smile that seemed to brighten the entire room. Now, Mrs. Peterson has prepared breakfast. Do you think you can make it downstairs, or shall I bring a tray up? I can manage stairs, Samuel said, rising from the bed. His body protested with various aches, but he ignored them. He had endured worse. Over the next few days, Samuel remained in town, staying at the boarding house and visiting Charlotte's clinic daily for treatment. Each visit lasted longer than strictly necessary for medical care, their conversations extending to personal histories, shared books, and tentative dreams for the future. Samuel found himself speaking more than he had in years, drawn out of his shell by Charlotte's genuine interest and thoughtful responses. On the fourth day, as Charlotte changed his bandages, Samuel made a decision. I've been thinking about Miller's offer, he said, watching her hands work with their usual gentle efficiency. About the blacksmith position, Charlotte looked up, her expression carefully neutral. And I'd like to try, Samuel said, the words feeling like a step off a cliff into unknown waters. If you truly believe it's possible with my hands. A smile broke across Charlotte's face, radiant and unreserved. I do, she said firmly. It may require patience and adaptation, but your experience and knowledge remain intact. Those can't be taken from you by scars. Her confidence bolstered his own. Then I'll speak with Miller when I return to the ranch. I'm glad, Charlotte said, securing the final bandage. The burns were healing well, the blisters receding without complication. You have a gift, Samuel. It would be a shame to let it go unused. As she spoke, her fingers lingered on his wrist, just beyond the edge of the bandage. The touch, light as it was, sent warmth through him that had nothing to do with his injuries. Without thinking, Samuel turned his hand and caught hers, his bandaged fingers closing gently around her smaller ones. Charlotte's eyes widened slightly, but she didn't pull away. For a long moment, they remained thus connected, the simple touch conveying more than words could express. Charlotte, Samuel began, uncertain what he meant to say but feeling compelled to speak. The clinic door opened, breaking the spell as Mrs. Peterson entered with a basket of fresh eggs. Good morning, Doctor. Oh, and Mr. Ryder. I've brought those eggs I promised you, Doctor, from my new hens. Charlotte withdrew her hand slowly, a faint color rising in her cheeks. Thank you, Mrs. Peterson. How thoughtful. The moment had passed, but something had shifted between them, an acknowledgement of feelings growing too strong to ignore. As Samuel left the clinic, he carried with him not only healing hands but also a healing heart, opening to possibilities he had long denied himself. When Samuel returned to Miller's ranch the following day, he found the owner in the corral, working with a young horse. Miller nodded in greeting, his appraising gaze taking in Samuel's bandaged hands and the new set of determination in his shoulders. "Doc says you're healing well," Miller commented, "though you're to stick to light duties for another few days." "Yes, sir," Samuel agreed. "Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something Charlotte Dr. Fairchild mentioned." Miller's weathered face broke into a knowing smile. "About the blacksmith position," Samuel nodded, surprised. "She said she'd spoken to you about it." "She did," Miller confirmed, leading the young horse to the fence. "Made a convincing case too, said you had the experience and knowledge, just needed some adjustments for your hands." He tied the horse securely and turned to face Samuel. "What I want to know is if you're interested." "I am," Samuel said, the certainty in his voice surprising even himself. "I trained under my father for years before the fire. If I can adapt, I believe I could serve the ranch well in that capacity." Miller studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "There's a small building near the east paddock that would make a decent smithy with some work. We'd need to order equipment from back east." He paused, then added, "It's an investment, Ryder. I'd need you to commit to staying on for at least a year." "I understand," Samuel replied. The thought of settling in one place, of building something permanent, no longer filled him with dread. "I'm prepared to make that commitment." Miller extended his hand. "Then we have a deal. Once those burns are fully healed, we'll get started on converting the building." As they shook hands, Samuel felt a weight lift from his shoulders, the burden of aimless wandering, of running from his past rather than building a future. For the first time in 2 years, he had a purpose beyond mere survival. The next few weeks passed in a flurry of activity. As his burns healed, Samuel divided his time between regular ranch duties and preparations for the new smithy. Miller ordered the necessary equipment from Chicago, while Samuel worked with the ranch carpenter to modify the small building to suit his needs. Charlotte visited the ranch regularly, ostensibly to check on various injuries among the hands, but she always made time to see Samuel. Their conversations flowed more easily now, the tentative connection between them strengthening with each meeting. It was during one such visit, as they walked from the main house to the developing smithy, that Charlotte broached a subject Samuel had been avoiding. "Have you ever considered removing your gloves permanently?" she asked, her tone casual though her question was anything but. Samuel glanced at her, surprised. His burns had healed enough that he no longer needed bandages, but he had immediately returned to wearing gloves, new ones purchased from the general store, as Charlotte's father's pair had been ruined in the fire. "Why would I do that?" he asked, though he suspected he knew her reasoning. "Because hiding your scars suggests shame," Charlotte replied directly, "and you have nothing to be ashamed of, Samuel." They had reached the smithy, and Samuel paused in the doorway, considering her words. "It's not shame," he said finally. "Not exactly, it's—" He searched for the right words. "It's privacy. Some things aren't meant for public viewing." Charlotte stepped closer, her expression gentle but determined. "Your scars tell a story of courage and sacrifice, of a son who tried to save his parents at great personal cost. Why hide that?" "Because it reminds me of failure," Samuel admitted, the truth he had carried for so long finally spoken aloud. "No," Charlotte said firmly. "It reminds others of heroism. It reminds you of loss, and that's different." She reached for his hand, her fingers closing around his gloved ones. "But perhaps it's time to let the reminder of loss become a reminder of survival instead." Samuel looked down at their joined hands, then slowly, deliberately removed the glove from his right hand. The scarred skin was exposed to the warm summer air, the marks of his past clearly visible. "I'm not sure I know how to do that," he said quietly. In response, Charlotte raised his bare hand to her lips and pressed a gentle kiss against his scarred palm. The gesture, so unexpected and tender, stole Samuel's breath. "Perhaps this is a start," she murmured against his skin. The barrier Samuel had maintained for so long between his past and his future, between his pain and the possibility of joy, crumbled in that moment. With his free hand, he reached up to touch Charlotte's cheek, his scarred fingers gentle against her soft skin. "Charlotte," he said, her name a whisper and a prayer. "I never thought I'd find someone who could look at these hands and see anything but damage." "I see strength," she replied, her eyes holding his with unwavering certainty. "I see healing, I see possibility." Samuel drew her closer, his heart pounding as he lowered his face to hers. "I see you," he said simply, before closing the distance between them in a kiss that felt like coming home after a long, solitary journey. The kiss was gentle at first, a tentative exploration, then deepened as Charlotte's arms wound around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "I've been alone for so long," he confessed. "I forgot what it felt like to connect with someone." "So have I," Charlotte replied, surprising him. "Being a female doctor doesn't exactly endear me to potential suitors. Most men want a wife who will focus solely on home and children, not one who might be called away at any hour to deliver a baby or set a broken bone." Samuel smiled, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear with his bare hand. "I'm not most men." "No," Charlotte agreed with a soft laugh. "You're certainly not." From that day forward, Samuel stopped wearing gloves unless the work specifically required them. At first, he felt exposed, vulnerable to the curious glances and occasional questions. But as Charlotte had predicted, most people showed only respect when they learned how his hands had been injured. The smithy was completed by early August, and the equipment arrived from Chicago soon after. With Charlotte's help, Samuel designed modified tools that accommodated his limited grip strength and reduced strain on his damaged fingers. The first time he successfully shaped a horseshoe in his new forge, the sense of accomplishment was overwhelming. Miller was impressed with the quality of Samuel's work and began spreading word to neighboring ranches that Whispering Pines now had a skilled blacksmith. Orders for tools, hardware, and repairs started to come in, keeping Samuel busy and fulfilled. His evenings were increasingly spent in Charlotte's company, either at the boarding house where she maintained a room, or at her small cabin on the edge of town, which she had rented shortly after establishing her practice. They shared meals, books, and conversations that stretched late into the night. Samuel found himself speaking of his parents with fondness rather than just grief, sharing memories he had long kept buried. As summer waned and the first hints of autumn touched the Montana landscape, Samuel realized he had made a decision without consciously considering it. One Sunday afternoon, as they walked along the creek that ran behind Miller's property, he stopped beneath a towering cottonwood tree. "I've been thinking," he began, suddenly nervous despite the certainty in his heart. Charlotte looked up at him, her eyes reflecting the deep blue of the September sky. About the future," Samuel said, taking her hands in his scarred ones. "My future, our future, if you're willing." A smile began to form on Charlotte's lips, but she remained silent, allowing him to continue. "I've ordered materials to build a house," he said. "A proper house, not far from town. Miller's given me a piece of land as part of my compensation, said a settled blacksmith is worth more than a drifting one." "That's wonderful, Samuel," Charlotte said, squeezing his hands encouragingly. "It would be," he agreed, "if you would consider sharing it with me." He took a deep breath, then said the words he had never imagined speaking to anyone. "Charlotte Fairchild, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife?" Joy bloomed across Charlotte's face like the first light of dawn. "Yes," she said without hesitation. "Yes, Samuel, I would be honored." He gathered her into his arms, his heart fuller than he had believed possible after so much loss. As he held her, Samuel reflected on the strange, winding path that had led him to this moment, how fire had taken everything from him, yet ultimately brought him to the woman who had helped him rebuild not just his life, but his capacity to love. They were married in October, with the aspen trees glowing gold against the deep blue Montana sky. The ceremony was small but joyful, attended by Miller and his wife, the ranch hands, and much of the town that had come to respect both the skilled blacksmith and their dedicated doctor. Samuel wore no gloves that day, his scarred hands visible to all as he placed a simple gold band on Charlotte's finger and received one in return. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel cupped Charlotte's face in his damaged hands and kissed her with a reverence that brought tears to more than one observer's eyes. Their house was completed by the first snowfall, a sturdy, welcoming structure with a separate room that served as Charlotte's examination space when patients couldn't make it to her clinic in town. Samuel built his own smithy adjacent to the house, allowing him to work even during the harsh Montana winters. As they settled into their life together, Samuel found that Charlotte had been right. His scars had become a reminder not of what he had lost, but of what he had survived and, more importantly, what he had found. Each time Charlotte took his hands in hers, each time she kissed the damaged skin without hesitation, the pain of the past receded a little more. On their first anniversary, as they sat before the fireplace in their home, Charlotte presented Samuel with a gift, a finely crafted set of specialized blacksmithing tools, designed specifically for his hands. "I had them made in Denver," she explained as he examined them with wonder. The tool maker was intrigued by the challenge. "They're perfect," Samuel said, testing the balance and grip of each implement. "Thank you," Charlotte smiled, a hint of mischief in her eyes. "I have one more gift," she said, "though it won't arrive for another 7 months or so." It took a moment for her meaning to register, and when it did, Samuel set the tools aside carefully before pulling her into his arms. "A baby?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Charlotte nodded, her eyes shining. "Are you happy?" "More than I ever thought possible," Samuel admitted, placing a hand gently against her still flat stomach. "Do you think he or she will mind having a father with hands like mine? Our child will be proud of these hands," Charlotte said firmly, covering his with her own. "As am I." In that moment, before the crackling fire that no longer held terror for him, Samuel Ryder finally made peace with his past. The fire that had taken so much from him had also set him on the path to find Charlotte, to build this life they now shared. His hands, marked forever by that terrible night, were now instruments of creation rather than reminders of destruction. As snow fell softly outside their window, Samuel held his wife close, marveling at how a man who had once thought himself beyond healing had found not only wholeness but abundance. He had learned, through Charlotte's love and his own journey, that scars were not endings but beginnings, visible reminders that even after devastating fire, new growth was not only possible but inevitable. "I love you," he whispered against her hair. "Every day I'm grateful for the moment you kissed my hands." "As am I," Charlotte replied, her voice soft with contentment. "It was the beginning of our story." A story, Samuel reflected, that had emerged from ashes to become more beautiful than he could have imagined, much like the Montana landscape after a fire, when wildflowers bloomed in breathtaking abundance across the renewed earth. Outside their window, the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, bearing witness to a truth as old as time itself. That love, like the most resilient of seeds, could take root and flourish even in ground that seemed forever scarred by flames.